Okay, so that means it's on right there. Just stand up there.
I'm gonna start by recording these guys and then two.
Okay, here we go.
Wait.
Well, I'd like to first welcome everybody here to Jamestown, Rhode Island. Welcome you here to my parents' home, and I say with a good amount of pride, welcome to Anna's garden. I gotta admit, I was kind of hoping for a teleprompter, so. But on behalf of my mother and my brother and my sister, we want to express our sincere appreciation and heartfelt gratitude to all of you for being with us today. Many of you have traveled very far distances and have made extensive efforts to be here. And I look around with every new face, it seems to trigger another memory. Memories that quite literally have spanned a lifetime. I think of Lars Garrison and his son Eric. I mean, the Bernath family grew up on Lars's Thanksgiving turkey, and I see a lot of, if not all, my aunts here. I don't think the last time my aunts were all in one room together, I think I was getting baptized. And I'd also like to make sure I recognize Hannah, who's here all the way from Colorado, who is, it's very hard to describe this, but who is my father's nephew's daughter. I don't know how that translates, but it's great to have her here. She was here earlier helping us get set up and so forth, so it's really wonderful to have her here as well. Just really so many friends, so many great friends, and both old and new. I was kind of wondering as we were kind of figuring out who was going to, who was coming and who wasn't, and watching people come in through the door, and I was thinking to myself, what my dad might think if he were here, or what he might say if he was here. And as many of you know my father, he's not the type of man to ever make any kind of a fuss. Certainly not a man to make a fuss about himself. And the only thing I could think of is he would probably say something like, "Steve, what's everybody doing here?" So, but the first time growing up, I got a hold of his Indiana University yearbook. I learned of his somewhat, I'll call it, understated nature. I got the book. I was feverishly going through it, looking for his photo, found it. It was a fairly typical college yearbook, he and three buddies. And anxiously, I scrolled down to the caption below to read his name in print, and I saw Sam Burnett. I was kind of surprised, kind of ran over to my dad and said, "Hey, Dad, I think they spelt your name wrong." He didn't say much. I said, "Dad, who's Sam?" And he just turned to me very simply and said, "Well, one day they started calling me Sam, and I never really corrected him." It was a little comforting when his brother, Bob, who lives in Indiana, was here back in March, and I think Bob was very pleased that we had referenced Sam in the obituary. And he did confirm that still today in Indianapolis, half of Indianapolis refer to my father as Joe, his birth name, and the other half refer to him as Sam. So, I never really asked him what caused him to kind of move to New York, but after putting all those pieces together, I would imagine maybe the pressure of that double life was getting too much for him. But it was a fortuitous decision on his part to move to New York. because that is where he met my mother. And, you know, a lot of people ask, and especially a lot of people ask growing up when they hear, you know, my mother's British accent for the first time, you know, how did your parents meet? And as she tells it, they were at a party in New York, and she saw this handsome, well-dressed, very tan gentleman across this proverbial crowded room. He must have just returned from some sort of business trip in the Caribbean, she imagined. So they met. And, you know, this is like, you know, very romantic. This is coming right out of the scene of, you know, this recently aired Pan Am series. But I think in this particular instance, we'll call this episode TWA. And as it turned out, yes, my dad, he was handsome, but the suit was borrowed, and the only reason he was tan was because he was unemployed and hanging out on the roof all day with his buddies. Nonetheless, a courtship ensued. I later asked my mother, you know, how did Dad propose? And surprising to me, I think, she had to think for a moment, and she explained that they were out again at a party, and without any notice at all, he simply just one day introduced her and said, "This is Anna, my fiancée." And evidently they walked away from that particular conversation, and my mom turned to Joe and said, "Joe, does this mean we're getting married then?" And he kind of just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Yeah." He wasn't romantic, I'll tell you. What a surprise that Grandma Ricks had her reservations. But, Faye, 47 years, you know, you can't beat it. So they started to build a life together, starting in Riverdale, New York, and then eventually moving to Chappaqua, where we spent the majority, not all of our growing years. And, you know, as all of you know, my father lost a lot of his hearing at a fairly early age, and I think it was something that was, you know, very difficult. I think it was very difficult for him professionally, in that he really was a wonderful teacher and loved teaching and loved the process of education. But as you can imagine, when that communication is interrupted by, you know, not being able to hear, not to mention the fact that you're teaching 7th and 8th graders in White Plains in the 1960s and 70s, you know, that could probably give anybody a headache. But his hearing actually was somewhat of a sense of humor in our family. You know, his conversations with people could really go two different ways. If he didn't know you and he was engaged in a conversation with you, then if you heard, or if ever I heard, the refrain, "Is that right? Is that right?" Usually 3, "Is that right?" That was a signal. "Steve, get me out of here. Get me over to the barbecue. I'll be happy for the rest of the night over there." On the other hand, if you were someone, as many of you are, that he was close with and felt comfortable with, the opposite was true. I mean, he could be very engaging and very talkative. I can remember we had a Christmas party back in, I think it was my senior year, and I remember seeing my dad talking with one of my great friends, Danny Dorn, in the corner, and my dad kind of zeroed in on him and started to talk with him, and I looked back 5 minutes later, and he was starting to gesticulate, and the conversation, you know, really went on for about 20-25 minutes, and I finally looked back, and somehow Danny, as polite as he is, finally extricated himself from the conversation, and he walked by me and he said, "Vern, your dad just gave me all the odds and the best way to play craps for the 11th time. So if any of you have gotten that unsolicited gambling ceremony, please take it as a compliment. My father taught us many things. Rarely was his style overt, with overt instruction, but mostly he taught simply by example. He was a loyal and dedicated husband, incredibly supportive and caring father, principled and honored man, a kind and decent human being. I remember when I was 12 years old, believe it or not, and I went down to Yorkville Savings Bank, and I withdrew $100 out of my bank account. And I went in, I filled the withdrawal slip out, big deal for a 12-year-old to do anyway. The teller handed me the money. I put the money into the billfold, and I walked out. And as I got out, I counted it. Of course, I'm on the streets of Chappaqua here, so I kind of had to, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Then suddenly, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. There was another $100. Quite the quandary for a 12-year-old, let me say. Initial instinct, go back. After about the third step, I thought maybe it needed some additional consideration. So I spent most of the afternoon with my friends, doing a little bit of a straw poll, figuring out what they thought, and pretty much, Bern, don't worry about it. They'll never miss it. Bern, you hit the lottery. Of course, this was all music to my ears, and so I decided to maybe solicit some opinions from older, wiser people, some parents. Some of you may have been polled. And I had some similar responses. It was their mistake. They're a big bank. They'll never miss it. So by the time I got home, I pretty much had convinced myself that not only did I not need to give it back, but I was pretty much entitled to it. But when I walked in, I saw the big guy. And I had to explain to him what happened. And he looked at me. He looked at the clock. It was 3:30. He said, "You got about 15 minutes to get that extra money back there." So I puffed and I puffed and I ran into the garage. I got my bank and down to Yorkville Savings. It was probably down there in 3 minutes. And I went in. I said, "Hi, I took the money out before, got an extra 100. There's a different teller." I gave her the money. She had no idea what was going on. She said, "Thank you," and then I left. And I thought, you know what? Everybody was right. And about 3 days later, I got a piece of mail from Yorkville Savings Bank, and it wasn't one of those 8x11 statements. It was a 3x5 note card. It was handwritten. It said, "Dear Mr. Burnett." Dear Mr. Burnett. I was 12 years old. "Thank you for bringing back the money. It was my second day in training, and if my draw was short, I would have been in a lot of trouble. He was the only person who I think instinctively thought of the other person on the side of that $100 bill. My father was not a particularly religious man, at least conventionally. My mom was the one who took us to church. Dad really never went to church.